Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Adrienne Esposito, the Executive Director of Citizens Campaign for the Environment. We're going to talk today to a fabulous panel here about offshore wind and climate change. Why do we need offshore wind to fight climate change, and what is happening in the realm of offshore wind development? It's a question we're getting more and more at our offices, and one that I think is worthy of such an important discussion. Offshore wind is a key component to fighting climate change on Long Island and throughout the state of New York. And exciting news is happening. Here in 2022, the first offshore wind farm has started construction. That's called the South Fork Wind Farm, and that's off of the South Fork of Long Island. It's the smallest of 5 that are moving through the permitting and the regulatory process. In addition, there have been many more leases, 6 in this case, that have been sold to other offshore wind companies throughout the globe that will be developing wind power for Long Island and New York State. So we're off and running. But we do get a lot of questions about wind. Why is it happening? What happens to our oceans? What about marine mammals? So we have experts here to answer those very important questions. Let me introduce you to this terrific panel that we're going to be talking to today. First, on my left, we have Rob DiGiovanni. Rob is the Executive Director and Chief Scientist of the Atlantic Marine Conservation Society. Next to him, we have Julie Tighe, a woman who I've worked with for years now, who is the President of the New York League of Conservation Voters. And last but absolutely not least, we have Carl Lobue, who's the New York Oceans Program Director and a marine scientist with the Nature Conservancy. So thank you. I really want to thank you guys for coming today and participating in this program. I think, Julie, we're going to start with you. Tell us, why are we developing offshore wind on Long Island and New York State? What policies in New York State have really worked to advance that? And why are we doing it?
Sure. So in 2019, the state of New York passed a historic nation-leading climate legislation called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that requires the entire state to move to 70% renewable energy by 2030 and 100% clean energy or zero-emission energy by 2040. So that means we have to make a lot of changes in our system, because right now only about 25 to 28% of our electricity comes from renewable energy sources, most of which are hydropower in upstate New York. And in particular, the law requires us to generate 9,000 megawatts of power from offshore wind by the year 2035. So there are firm commitments that the state is making, which I think is actually the largest commitment to offshore wind in the entire country, which is very exciting for us here. It's a real opportunity for us to really make the move off of fossil fuels, which we know are polluting our communities, are subject to geopolitical, imbalances like we're seeing because of the issues between Ukraine and Russia right now, where we're far too dependent on that, and they're very subject to these global pricing issues. Whereas renewable energy, including offshore wind, is going to be much more stable. So we're very excited to see them start having offshore wind projects here in Long Island, because not only are we having our entire energy system move to renewable energy, including the significant amount of offshore wind, which is enough to power millions of homes if we get to 9,000 gigawatts. But we also are moving towards electrification of our buildings, of how we heat and cool our homes, how we're moving to electrification of the transportation sector. So really, we need the grid to be green first as we're making all of these moves, which is why it's really critical that the state law included these first components so firmly on moving to clean energy in the statute, rather than just seeing what happens, so that we can make these much cleaner transitions and move us off of polluting fossil fuels.
Right. I think it's interesting for me because, having been in the environmental movement for just a few years, like 30, it used to be 10, 20 years ago, people didn't believe in climate change. And now, unfortunately, we are forced to understand the ramifications of it. Particularly on Long Island, Lower Manhattan, where when the storms come, so do the floods. So does the property damage. And unfortunately, so does the loss of life. So we are in a situation right now where we are not worrying about climate change of the future, we're experiencing climate change ramifications today. And so that's another compelling reason, for transitioning off of fossil fuels. And, people tell me all the time, are these things good for the ocean? And I have to ask them, well, is drilling for oil good for the ocean? I mean, have you ever seen a wind spill? I think not. So, Carl, I want to go to you next as a marine scientist. What does climate change do to our oceans? What are you finding out there?
Yeah, and really appreciate the question because as a representative on the New York State's Offshore Wind Environmental Working Group, I'm often on panels like this where the discussion is around the potential impacts of offshore wind development on marine life. And that's a really important subject. But in that context, we sometimes lose the perspective of what the impacts of climate change is already having on marine life, which is really a big driver of why we need to see these projects move forward. Globally, we're having serious issues around the oceans for climate change. Some of the worst, most severe impacts happening around the poles. I think about polar bears, and around the tropics and coral reefs. And there's really, those are places that are not transitional places. So it's either getting too hot or they're losing those cold refuges. But we're having issues here, right here on Long Island in New York. I can recall in my previous career, 20 years ago, I was in the unfortunate position of having to write the fishery disaster declaration for the American lobster fishery, which collapsed in Long Island Sound. And it wasn't until years after that we learned that that was a climate-driven loss of that fishery, which has since spread to all of southern New England. That was once our most lucrative commercial fishery. Fishermen who are my age or older can remember St. Patrick's Day used to be the big opening for winter flounder, which was our most important recreational fishery in New York. That fishery is gone. Now we know that there was a compounding factor with overfishing there, but climate and warming waters is a major driver of that. And it's actually a good lesson there, that kind of combination of fishing pressure and climate change, because it's something that we're seeing elsewhere in New York where climate change is an exacerbating factor on another issue. You and I work really closely on the topic of harmful algal blooms. The combination of nitrogen pollution and warming waters is making the way for new and different kinds of harmful algal blooms, like the rust tides that we're seeing in the summer times, that we didn't usually have that long period of warm water in some of our bays. The combination of warmer water and that nutrient pollution is impacting our eelgrass meadows. We're starting to see marine pathogens that we didn't used to see because of warming waters.
So I just want to say, Carl, so can you definitively say for our viewers that are our waters, Long Island Sound, the South Shore Estuary bays, Great South Bay, Peconic Estuary, are they warmer today than they used to be?
Yes.
Okay.
And we will continue to see that trend.
Okay, and that's unfortunate. I mean, for everyone watching, that I think we now, unfortunately, the terms brown tide, red tide, as you said, rust tide, mahogany tide, and if you live around Lake Ronkonkoma, for instance, blue-green algae blooms, are all becoming household words. And these toxic tides are not a rainbow of colors. They're actually pretty deadly in some cases. So it's a very serious impact, and it relates back to climate change and why we need to fight it. And offshore wind is part of that puzzle piece. But let me go to you now, Rob. We do get a lot of questions at our office about whales, and will the offshore wind farms impact not just whales, but sea turtles, marine turtles, and also seals, dolphins? Will it impact their migratory pathways? Will it impact their feeding ability off of the shores of New York City and Long Island?
So these are really good questions, and these are questions that we're all trying to understand what those impacts are. We all understand that whatever we do, whether it be driving our car or walking, we all have an impact on the environment. We just need to understand what the magnitude of those impacts are. What's interesting about, and we're all, I think, not trying to date ourselves, but 30 years ago, we wouldn't really be talking too much about whales or seals or sea turtles. I mean, that was a rare occurrence that you had. It wasn't, you didn't have as many animals that were coming up. But what we're seeing is in the changing environment that we have, we see whales on a regular basis. I mean, now we have whales that wash up on our shores for many reasons, that whether it be entanglement, fish strikes, or just natural causes. So those are things that we will continue to investigate, but they also come with, the bigger side that we have a number of animals that are out there. You can go out and be out on the beach, and you hear from almost, I don't want to say everybody because that's really, really bold, but more times than not, I'll have people say, instead of saying I had no idea whales were here, they say, oh, I was here the other day and I saw a whale offshore. Well, that's a changing environment. And is that good or bad? I mean, it's great that we're seeing them, but how is the habitat that they're feeding in? How is that operating, and are we able to sustain these animals? So that's some things that we need to look at.
I just got to jump in and say, I was at Robert Moses last summer and saw whales jumping, and the whole beach stopped. Everybody got up, and everybody was pointing and laughing. It's such a wonderful experience, and you're right. We see so many more now. So how will wind farms impact that?
Well, and that's a good question. So you can look at these animals, they move through areas just like we have ships that are going through there. There's always factors of noise, and does that change their behavior? Those are things that we really need to understand more readily, but it's also if they're coming up through these areas and they're following food and there's food around, I use very bad examples, but if you move the buffet from here to there, I'm going to follow the buffet. So in a case of animals, that they can move, it's really, does that impact their food source when they're going? And those are where one of the benefits that I see that we have going on right now is that we're doing a lot more studies of our environment to understand what's happening with the fisheries, what's happening with plankton, and what's happening with the whale populations, to see how those are interrelated. And it's a result of projects like this. And this is not just on Long Island or New York. It's actually in the whole New York Bight, which ranges from the tip of New Jersey all the way out to the end of Montauk. So in that whole area, you can see animals. And what I really want to point out is that many years ago I started doing aerial surveys, looking for whales and dolphins. And a lot of times you would just go through and not see a lot of animals, and even to the point where we used to count schools of fish because we didn't see that many. Now that we're seeing a lot more, so we don't necessarily count them as individuals, we count them as big groups, but also now we're seeing a lot more whales throughout this area and throughout the time. And that's what we used to see historically.
But why? Why are we seeing more whales now? Do you know?
Well, I think that a lot of it's related. I go back to food. There's food in the area. We have food coming through here.
All goes back to food.
It's a historic migratory route for the North Atlantic right whale. So we know that historically, we know we have whaling ports that were here. Well, the whaling ports were not put here because whales were not here.
Right.
So whales were here at one point in time, and now we're starting to see kind of a resurgence in some of these animals, and different species. The question is, are they moving from one area to another? And that's why we need to look at this on a much broader scale. And that's where collaborating on projects to look at what's going on in the Mid-Atlantic, the New York Bight or the area off our shores, and then even up north to see how are the animals moving around, and then we can measure those impacts on a much greater. And I'm really, it's a time where you couldn't even think about how much we would be talking about whales and dolphins and sea turtles 30 years ago. It was really just a very odd scenario. And now, even sea turtles. You said the Long Island Sound is getting warmer. Well, we might have sea turtles here more readily in our bays, and we have dolphins in Long Island Sound. So these are exciting things that we see, but we need to be able to study that to understand what those impacts might be.
Okay.
Well, and Rob, isn't some of that change because water quality is improving, because we've been taking action to reduce pollution as well as the warming waters? I think when I was at the Department of Environmental Conservation, we talked a lot about like there's a lot more fluke, the summer flounder, in the New York area, in part because migratory patterns have changed because of the warming waters. Mm-hmm. But we also have much cleaner water than we used to because we've been doing a lot of work since the implementation of the Clean Water Act.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point in the sense that you have animals that are coming into the area. You make a better habitat for these animals, then you might have more animals that stay around. I've always used the highway example, and this is probably is that you think of the highways of we all probably heard about the highways of the 70s when you're going down the road and you go to a rest area and they had a vending machine and you spent like the least amount of time there. Mm-hmm. Well, now you go to the highway system, you go to a rest area and you can get a vegan meal, you can get a latte, you're going to spend more time in those areas, which means you're going to see this.
So that's what the whales do?
So if you have a better habitat, then you will actually have more animals that might stay in the area more. And so that's where you're looking at that and saying, hey, we're seeing more of these animals.
But I think that's a really good point. So the viewers don't think the news is all bad. Good policy works. So we
And
have
fisheries management works.
Yes.
and fisheries management works. And we've been we collectively in the environmental community with government agencies have been working to implement good policies, and it is working. I mean, we have whales, we have, Carl here championed the Save the Menhaden fish, and I think that's been a big reason for some of the whales coming back, is because we have now more menhaden, which are
It's a buffet.
That's part of the buffet. That's right. But for those in local terms, it's bunker fish, because I grew up calling them bunker. We use bunker to crab and whatnot. So we've been working hard to restore this wonderful resource we have, our estuaries. We have 3 estuaries on Long Island, 5 estuaries in New York State, and an ocean. I mean, we really are water rich here. I just want to go back to you, Julie, for a second. So why is your organization, LCV, besides for state policy, which now it's mandated, why do you think offshore wind has to be part of the mix to fight climate change? How serious do you think the climate crisis is?
Well, the climate crisis is without doubt the worst, the biggest crisis we are all facing as a country. It's an existential threat to the entire world, right? Where we really need to take care here to remove this pollution, which is impacting in particular low-income communities and communities of color, which is often where we've cited fossil fuel pollution, right? We are seeing those warming waters come up with much more flooding, much more intense and more frequent storms that we know is going to impact us. We know that Congress has provided some funding as part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that will help to move us towards clean energy, but we need to get more of the climate provisions from Build Back Better so that we're getting more clean energy so that we can cut that pollution. We've been talking a lot about environmental impacts. We have not talked a lot about public health impacts, right? So that is something that we know that air pollution causes major respiratory ailments, and there's something that we can do to take action on that. Clean energy doesn't have any air impacts. So that is like a huge public health factor. We saw that during the first year of COVID, right? There was way less car traffic in New York City, and there was a 25% reduction in air pollution, right? And that's amazing. That is discernible. You know, asthma is the leading cause of school absenteeism. So our kids are getting sick from this. So it's very important to us to take action on climate change, not just because of state policy, but to help our communities be able to literally breathe better.
Right.
So to us, this is a top priority. We need every level of government to be taking action because it's going to require federal government investments and support, like what we've seen with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, making more lands available in the New York Bight, which is the area between Montauk and Cape May, New Jersey, right,
Yes.
Carl? Carl's the expert here on this. That's going to make a lot more wind available. It also is putting it critically close to the areas of the population centers so that you're not, where it's very difficult to put in clean energy otherwise, right? New York City does not have room for acres and acres of solar power, or for big wind farms. So we need the ocean being much closer to that. It makes it a lot easier than otherwise. We need both. Like, we're going to need power from upstate New York, we're going to need hydropower, we're going to need solar power, but having the offshore wind close to those population density centers where we're using so much energy really is a critical factor, and allows us to also get folks from our cities also involved in the jobs associated with that. So it's public health, it's environment, it's jobs.
Right. And I think that's a really good point I want to make, is that sometimes people say to me all the time, well, I really don't want anything in the ocean. And I say, I agree. I mean, I would love if we lived in a world where we didn't have to put any structures in the ocean, but we're not there anymore. All large-scale energy infrastructure has some impact on our environment, but it's up to us to choose that infrastructure that has the least impact on the environment. And that is offshore wind as one of those answers. And that's one of the reasons I think it's very important to continue to advance this technology as part of our energy mix. But Carl, I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what's climate change doing to our estuaries in New York State and Long Island and our ocean waters? I mean, would you say, you could even talk about, acidification as a concern, because I don't think most viewers know what that is, but yet it's very real.
Yes. So And our estuaries are in this transitional environment, so we are seeing big changes, and some are we're not going to be happy with, and some are not going to be so bad, but it will be different. Acidification happens when you basically increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It increases in the water. It makes the water more acidy. It's also a side effect of nutrient pollution. So it's one of those, again, synergistic aspects where you have climate change and pollution exacerbating an issue. It impacts everything that makes bones and shells. That's marine life, and that includes all the shellfish that we care about. And it's a major concern. And I think that, to your previous question to Julie, the math doesn't add up without offshore wind for New York to meet its important and ambitious climate goals. We need to do it carefully and thoughtfully. We need to learn from the early projects and rapidly adapt as we learn things. But the bottom line is it's an essential component for our path forward in New York, and it has an added benefit when you start to think about energy independence and moving human health. A lot of that human health issue comes from transportation, electrifying our transportation. We need more energy to do that. Clean energy that's not bound by global events that escalates the price of oil and gas.
Thank you. I think that's exactly right.
I think Carl makes, to follow up on the point about evaluating what these impacts are and being able to roll those data or information forward is really what's critical here. And I think that that's what we're able to do with this new process, is we're being able to collect data in a changing environment and try to measure those impacts and then put forth mitigation measures. So, when I look at it, we haven't done this historically and looked at what other impacts, or whether it be an automobile, we didn't look at those long-term impacts. And here we're actually working in the right order, where we're looking at what do we have now, what are the potential threats, what didn't we know. And that's what's really exciting about this, is that we can probably make a lot better decisions than we did historically, which hopefully will get us out of these issues. But if we had done this 50 or 60 years ago, we probably wouldn't be sitting here talking about it.
And obviously, Adrienne, you New York League of Conservation Voters and Citizens Campaign for the Environment, we've been trying to help educate the public about the potential impacts and about the fact that wind energy is coming, so that the general public has the opportunity to ask questions of scientists, like both of yourselves have been on some of our forums that we've had, some of our educational forums, also of the developers who are doing these projects, so that there's an opportunity for a dialogue and to help address the concerns that people have and to help provide good information. Because all too often there are people who are reliant on, bad information or misinformation, not on purpose, but just because they don't know. And we're trying to make sure that they're informed about the potential impacts and what's being done to protect them. And to your point earlier, right, we're going to have to have energy come from somewhere.
Right, that's right.
It's coming from somewhere. We're going to need more of it. We're not going to have less of it. That's not where our universe is going, although we would like everyone to be more energy efficient with what's out there. But I think really sort of providing the opportunity for people to understand is a critical role, and one that we're going to learn too, as we move forward and keep providing that information to the public. So certainly keep an eye out for those public education forums.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the most important things I think we need to remember is that not only is climate change real, but it really is impacting all of our lives. On a global level, or even on a national level, it shifts the way we can grow food. It's causing severe drought in the West. It's causing sea level rise on Long Island, where I live. It is causing phenomena called sunny day flooding, where it's a beautiful sunny day, and yet the tide is high and it's pushing the rivers into the streets, and people have to move their cars, and that really devalues your home. It's causing phenomena like it pushes into Long Island's aquifer, polluting it with salt water instead of the fresh water that we need. It extends, the worst part is it extends the mosquito season, okay? Nobody likes that. But it has all of these smaller impacts that we don't necessarily see right up front that actually have real meaning in our lives. And we need to tackle it. We need to really advance renewable technologies, wind, solar, hydropower, that comes from Canada and upstate New York, and bring it downstate. These are the things that we think will bring us a more sustainable livable, lovable future for our island and the things that we value. You know, I think everyone wants to grow up. We live on Long Island. I'll just talk about Long Island because I'm a little parochial because I live there. But for a reason, it's because we get to live by the water. You know, I grew up with a fishing pole in one hand and a crab trap in the other, and I think every kid should have the opportunity to grow up like that. But we're not going to have that if we don't address the climate crisis that is now upon us. So I think that's one of the main reasons why we're all here today talking about offshore wind, talking about how to tackle it. All right, we only have a few minutes left. Anybody have any last thoughts or last comments you'd like to make?
Well, I just wanted to follow up on what you were talking about when we looked at COVID and looked at the reduction in how much we were using automobiles, is that to me, you can look at a negative and say, where's the positive? And the positive is we can make a difference. We can make change. And that's what we should be looking at, is that let's work together to try and implement those changes on all fronts, not just when we look at wind energy, but we can make differences in how we travel and what we do. And making people more aware is a big part of this. So I thank you for letting me talk.
I think it's amazing what you're seeing, where we have environmental groups working with energy groups, working with labor groups, working with the business community, because we all see that we need to move towards a green economy, right? And so that, to me, is something that can be better for our public health, because we all know people want to live in communities that their children can grow up drinking clean water and breathing clean air. So we know we need to fight climate change and make it front and center so that everyone has that opportunity, and so that we can stop having fossil fuel polluting facilities, in particular in those low-income communities and communities of color.
I'm a scientist, and my career is designed to help protect the ocean. And there are folks like me who are fighting every day to make sure that it gets done. And I think I think everyone's on board. No one wants this. Is going to take a long time to do.
Yes.
And if it doesn't get done right, it jeopardizes this long-term effort. And I do think that everybody that I am working with, on all aspects, from the private developers to the agencies, all want to see it done in a way that nobody regrets.
And I think politicians are getting the message. I can tell you that from my organization's perspective, more candidates than ever are coming to us to seek our endorsement, because they know that their constituents care about climate change and the environment and clean water, in particular here on Long Island, and that is a nonpartisan issue.
Right. And that's what I want to end on that note, because it is a nonpartisan issue. It's a bipartisan issue. We're all in it together. You know, one earth, one chance, as they say. And we have to we have to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. We can no longer be fossil fools, as we like to say. We need to make this transition. We are going to make this transition. We need the public support. We need the public's understanding of it. So I'd like to thank everyone who stuck it out with us today and joined us for this talk about climate change and marine impacts and what our future holds. We want to thank everybody. And we also want to thank our sponsor today, which is the Long Island Community Foundation. So we hope to see you guys soon. Please log on to Citizens Campaign for the Environment's website, citizenscampaign.org, or windworkslongisland.org for more information on offshore wind. Thank you, everyone.